Welcome back, everyone. Today I want to talk to you about why I stopped using analogies when getting into arguments with people or discussions, and why I think you should also stop using analogies. I started thinking about this a few months ago when I heard Scott Adams on Sam Harris's podcast, and Scott Adams, near the beginning of the podcast, he asked Sam Harris to not use any analogies in anything he said, to not while they were arguing, bring up any analogies. And it was somewhat amusing that Sam Harris was not able to comply with this. He was sort of accidentally slipping into making analogies. But ever since listening to that and listening to some other things that Scott Adams has said about analogies, I've not used them at all. Very rarely I've used analogies in arguments with people. And I find that I don't need them, and I'm actually better at arguing because of it. So analogies are, as you probably know, a way of taking your argument, putting it in a completely different context, and trying to get the other person to see why your principle stands in X context, and why that means, therefore, that it also stands up in Y context, in whatever context you're talking about. That's kind of complicated, so I'm going to give an example. I'm going to use an example that libertarians and anarchists use all the time. An analogy that they make is talking about taxation. You may know that anarchists especially are not particularly in favour of taxation, and often you'll hear people say that taxation is theft. That's not an expression that I use personally, but just the expression taxation is theft is somewhat of an analogy, but you'll sometimes hear anarchists and extreme libertarians talking about how taxation is it's like the government putting its hands in your pockets, taking money that you're making and giving it to other people. And sometimes the analogies even get more complicated than that, talking about a desert island where you're in some sort of society, and the proceeds, the things that you're making, the trees you're chopping down, the fish you're catching, get taken from you and given to people who didn't work as hard for those things. And that's basically the analogy for the ethical reason why a lot of people don't believe in taxation. And although I'm not talking about that point of view in this video, I'm just talking about why I think making an analogy like that is not really helpful. When you tell a story to demonstrate your point, or you're trying to get the person to understand how that relates to the real world, I think it really opens up the door for the person you're talking to just criticize the story. They're just going to say, well, that's not like real life because of A, B, and C. You've just given them something to distract themselves with that isn't your actual point. You've given them this story that they can take apart and say, well, this isn't the same. That's a desert island, not New York City. You could come up with loads of reasons why the story is not like real life. And I see this happen in arguments a lot. The argument just becomes about why the analogy is different to real life, even though those differences actually might not matter, or maybe they do. If the analogy is structured very well, if it's a very well-made analogy, what you want to be doing is to have those questions about how it's different to real life be the important questions in the argument. You want those differences to be meaningful, but there's a very possible they won't be, especially if you haven't thought through the analogy properly. And although the differences between the analogy and real life may not seem important to you, the person you're arguing with may think they're very important, and they will just be distracting in that case. Rather than using analogies, it's usually possible in pretty much every scenario that I've been in where I've reflexively wanted to use an analogy and stopped myself, it's been possible to just explain the principle I'm trying to demonstrate. The thing that I was trying to talk about with the analogy, I can just explain it. It takes a little bit more imagination and a little bit more work, but I think the argument that I structure as a result of not leaning on analogies as a kind of crutch. I actually can formulate a better argument if I just talk about the principles in real life, how the things that I'm saying apply in a real life setting rather than applying them to an imaginary setting. So for example, with the taxation analogy, rather than talking about some imaginary person stealing money from some other imaginary person, I might just talk about why I think people who work hard should be able to keep their money, and I'll talk about why I believe that is ethical. Maybe I'll talk about people who really exist, people who have existed in history, and what they have done to earn their money. Maybe I'll draw upon real statistics from the real world that demonstrate my point. And now I can already hear a lot of people in the comments talking about how analogies are really helpful, or how I've made analogies in my videos. So I'm just going to go through a list of things that are not analogies, or things that I'm not talking about in this video. So a hypothetical situation is not always an analogy. Of course it can be, but if you're talking about applying a principle, if you're talking about a law, if you're discussing hate speech or abortion or some law that impacts people, which is, all laws do, you might want to talk about an individual scenario and how the law will affect the person in that scenario. Someone who really could exist and who would be affected by that law. That's a hypothetical. And although analogies are sometimes hypotheticals, they're not, they're not always the same thing. Another thing that's sometimes looks like an analogy but isn't is a story or an anecdote. And although those are also not very good for making arguments, you may have noticed that I do sometimes bring in stories to my videos. Stories, not in a formal debate or in an argument, but in general, especially when making videos, they do capture people's imaginations and they do draw people in, I think, keep people interested. And similarly, analogies can be very engaging if you have an analogy in all stories are pretty much analogies in some ways. Any fictional story is kind of analogous to real life or to real life struggles. And of course they're very entertaining and can be very beautiful. I think that's best kept to a certain domain that is outside of the argumentation domain. Another place where analogies are useful is if you're trying to demonstrate a principle. Like if I'm teaching people about electricity, I'll often talk about cars driving down a road, or if I'm talking about photons or any kind of particles moving around in space. You usually imagine them as like tennis balls, or just sort of some kind of squishy balls that are bouncing against each other in free air, or things that aren't actually a good model of what particles, molecules, photons, what they actually behave like and what they look like. But to help demonstrate a principle, it might help you to imagine it that way. To imagine cars driving down a road, sometimes very helpful for thinking about current and resistance in a circuit. But in that scenario, it's more about teaching someone than about persuading them, or about persuading some other people who might be listening. That's usually the goal of an argument, is to be persuasive either to the person you're arguing with or to the people watching. If somebody's sitting in front of you asking them to explain electricity, then you're not persuading them, you're just trying to teach them something and maybe keep them entertained while doing it. It's not the same situation. I think if you do need to use analogies, if you feel like you have to, then it's important to keep the analogy as similar to the real life thing you're talking about, or keep it as grounded in reality as possible, so that the person you're explaining something to or arguing with doesn't have as much room to point out the flaws or point out just the differences that might not even matter. They keep it as close as possible. Like if you're talking about some gendered issue, something that bad that happens to women, you might want to come back with a similar hypothetical situation happening to a man. You say, well, this thing happening to a woman is analogous to this thing that men experience. And that can be effective when discussing gender and sex, but you really need to keep it as close as possible. Don't change anything else about the scenario unless you really need to. A very powerful way of making an analogy without changing very much at all of the situation is just to switch the person being described, or the person involved in whatever you're talking about, and just make it about about the person you're talking to. Just say, what if it were you? Or what if it were your daughter? What if it were your wife? That's a very simple analogy. There's really nothing changing in that scenario except the person who is being talked about. People feel differently when a situation is being described and being applied to a stranger than when they think about if that stranger was someone they loved or even themselves. But what do you think? Are there some analogies that you really like to use in arguments that you think are good and that you know have worked in the past? Do you think that, are there any analogies that really annoy you that you've heard other people use? Just let me know in the comments. I don't have much time to edit this video this weekend, so I'm going to try and keep this one kind of rough, not doing many jump cuts. I've heard some people in the comments are complaining about my editing style, so I'm trying this week, and if it saves me time, then I guess I'll do it more in the future. I don't want the videos to get boring because of all my pauses and saying and all the time, but I guess if it's more natural and people like it, then I'll go with it. I'm going to be talking to Georgia Free on Sunday morning, and I hope to get that edited and released on maybe Monday, Tuesday, something like that. So look out for that interview. She's got a great channel if you want to go there and check out all of her videos, get ready for the interview. It's not going to be an interview, we're just going to be discussing some of the things she talks about in her video, talking about modern relationships, modern women, men, the changing relationship between the sexes. I think it's going to be very interesting. I'm looking forward to it. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again very soon.
Weddings are like little girls' tea parties, except the women are the stuffed animals, the men are making them talk, and they're not drinking tea. They're drinking antiquated gender roles.
Somebody tell Britta what an analogy is.
I know what it is. It's like a thought with another thought's hat on.